The summer of 1990 arrived the way summers always do in Clover Ridge, Tennessee, slow and hunted, with the kind of heat that clings to your clothes before you even step off the porch. It was the sort of town where everyone knew your name, your business, and the color of your car. And on the morning of Saturday, June 23, 1990, almost everyone on Delaney Street noticed the same thing. Raymond Holt was loading up his blue 1987 Ford Taurus, and his daughter Callie was dancing around the driveway like she'd just been told Christmas came early. Raymond Holt was 38 years old that summer. He had the kind of face that told you everything he'd been through, laugh lines that had deepened a little too fast, a jaw that was always slightly set, dark eyes that were warm but tired in the way that single father's eyes tend to be. He worked the early shift at the Clover Ridge paper mill 6 days a week, and on the 7th day, he did not rest. He mowed the lawn, fixed the gutters, and made Sunday pancakes shaped like dinosaurs because Callie had asked him to back in February and he hadn't forgotten. Callie Holt was 12 years old, and she was the kind of child that made people believe in good things. She had her father's dark eyes and her mother's stubborn chin, and she kept a journal that she called her field notebook because she had decided, at age 9, that she was going to be a wildlife biologist. She talked about animals the way other kids talked about movie stars. She kept a pressed wildflower collection under her bed. She wrote letters to her grandmother in Alabama every single week without being asked. The divorce had been finalized 8 months earlier. It had not been an ugly divorce, at least not in the way divorces sometimes are, with screaming and accusations. It had been the quieter kind of ugly, where two people realize they have grown into shapes that no longer fit together, and both of them know it, and the knowing is its own kind of grief. Raymond had stayed in the house on Delaney Street. Callie's mother, Diane, had moved 20 minutes away to Holland Falls. The custody arrangement was civil. Callie spent weekdays with her mother during the school year and alternating weekends with her father. This particular weekend was Raymond's. He had planned the trip for 3 weeks. Nothing elaborate, just a long drive down to Lake Fontana in the Smoky Mountain region, where he and Callie would camp for one night under the stars, do a little fishing, maybe spot some of the wildlife she was always reading about. He had packed their blue tent with a broken zipper that he'd repaired with duct tape. He had packed a cooler with sandwiches and grape soda and the good trail mix, the kind with real chocolate chips, not carob. He had packed Callie's field notebook and 3 of her wildflower guides. "We're going somewhere special," Callie had told her best friend, Maya, on the phone the night before. Her voice was light and giddy, the way it got when she was truly happy. "Daddy says we might see a black bear." Maya would remember that phone call for the rest of her life. At 7:43 in the morning, Raymond Holt buckled his seatbelt in that blue Ford Taurus and backed out of the driveway on Delaney Street. His neighbor, Earl Piquette, was already out watering his tomatoes, and he raised a hand in a wave. Raymond honked twice, short and cheerful. Callie was in the passenger seat with her feet up on the dashboard the way Raymond usually told her not to do. And this time he didn't say anything. He just smiled. That wave from Earl Piquette would be the last confirmed visual of Raymond and Callie Holt by anyone who knew them. They never came home. And for 10 years, the blue Ford Taurus was nowhere to be found. Until it was. Before we follow that blue car down the highway and into the silence that swallowed it, you need to understand something about Raymond Holt's life in the weeks leading up to that June morning. Because nothing about a disappearance like this exists in a vacuum. There are always threads, small, fraying threads, that you only recognize as significant after the worst has already happened. 3 weeks before the road trip, Raymond had an argument. Not a small disagreement, not a raised eyebrow across a counter, a real argument, the kind that rattled the walls. His next-door neighbor on the other side, a man named Gary Fennick, had heard it through the shed fence. Raymond was on the phone, speaking in a low, tense voice that kept climbing in spite of itself. Gary couldn't make out all the words, but he heard 2 things clearly. He heard Raymond say, "You don't get to tell me what to do anymore." And then, several minutes later, with a tone that Gary described as a man trying very hard to stay in control. Raymond said, "Just stay away from us." Gary didn't think much of it at the time. People argued on the phone. Divorces were messy. He went inside and turned on the television and forgot about it entirely. He would remember it the following Monday, when Diane Hall called the Clover Ridge Police Department and reported that her ex-husband and daughter had not returned from their road trip. Raymond had not told Diane the specific details of where they were going. This was not unusual. They were divorced and co-parenting from separate homes, not checking in with each other about weekend plans. What Diane knew was that Raymond had planned a camping trip somewhere in the Smokies region, and that Callie was supposed to be dropped off at her house Sunday evening by 7 o'clock. When 7 o'clock became 8 o'clock became midnight, Diane began to feel the first cold edges of something wrong. By 6 the next morning, she was on the phone with the police. The officer who took her call, a young deputy named Thomas Reese, asked her the standard questions. Had Raymond ever done anything like this before? No. Was there any reason to believe Raymond might want to take Callie somewhere without telling her? Diane hesitated. She said no. But the hesitation itself was something Deputy Reese would think about later. What Diane didn't say in that phone call, what she would only say months later, when investigators pressed her, was that Raymond had seemed different in the weeks before the trip. Quieter than usual. Careful in a way that wasn't like him. He had called her twice in the 10 days before the road trip, which was unusual. They typically communicated through text messages or through Callie herself. During one of those calls, he had asked Diane a question that had struck her as odd at the time and struck her as something else entirely now. He had asked her, "If something ever happened to me, you'd make sure Callie was okay, right? Like, you'd fight for her." Diane had laughed it off. She'd said something like, "Raymond, don't be dramatic." And he had laughed too. And the conversation had moved on. She would replay that conversation in her mind almost every day for the next decade. Meanwhile, the Clover Ridge Police Department began the process of tracing Raymond and Callie's route. They had a starting point, the driveway on Delaney Street at 7:43 a.m. on June 23rd. They had a general destination, Lake Fontana area, a roughly 90-mile drive south through a patchwork of state and rural highways. And they began working forward from there, one breadcrumb at a time. The first breadcrumb was solid. At 10:17 a.m., Raymond's credit card was charged at a Sunnyside gas station on Route 41S, approximately 34 miles south of Clover Ridge. The attendant on duty, a teenager named Dennis Pratt, remembered them. He remembered the blue car because he thought it needed new tires. He remembered the little girl because she came inside and bought a pack of peanut butter crackers and asked him if he'd ever seen a wild turkey. He told investigators that both father and daughter seemed totally normal, real friendly. He watched them pull back out onto Route 41S heading south and thought nothing more of it. That was 10:17 a.m. The second breadcrumb was different in texture and tone. At 12:04 p.m., a call was placed to Diane's home telephone number from a payphone located outside a diner called Lou's Roadside, situated on a county road designated CR7, approximately 52 miles south of Clover Ridge. Diane missed the call. She was at the grocery store. The message Raymond left on the answering machine lasted 43 seconds. Diane would listen to that recording hundreds of times in the years that followed. In the recording, Raymond said that they were making good time. He said the weather was beautiful. He mentioned that Callie had fallen asleep in the passenger seat. And then, near the end of the message, his voice changed. Just slightly. Just for a moment. The way a voice changes when someone is choosing their words with unusual care. He said, "Hey, listen, if I don't get a chance to call you tonight, don't worry. Signal's gonna be rough near the lake. We're all good." A pause. Then, "Take care of yourself, Diane." Investigators would later note that he did not say "we'll see you Sunday." He did not say "I'll have Callie back by 7." He said "we're all good." Present tense, not forward-looking. And he said goodbye to Diane in a way that, she would later testify through tears, felt like a real goodbye. The third breadcrumb came from a man named Clifton Ware, a truck driver who regularly ran goods between Highland Falls and a distribution center further south. Clifton told police that at approximately 2:30 p.m. on June 23rd, he spotted a blue Ford Taurus pulled over on the shoulder of CR7, roughly 12 miles south of Lou's roadside. The hazard lights were on. He could see someone standing outside the car. A man, he thought, tall, dark hair, but didn't stop because he was behind schedule. He assumed it was a standard breakdown. Police drove that stretch of CR7 2 days later. No car. No evidence of a car having been parked there. No tire tracks on the soft shoulder. No litter. Nothing. It was almost as if the car had driven off the edge of the world. When a person goes missing in rural Tennessee, there is a particular kind of community mobilization that takes place, quiet but immense, the way a river rises before you realize a flood is coming. Within 48 hours of Diane's call to the police, volunteers were being organized at the Clover Ridge Baptist Church Fellowship Hall. Maps were spread across folding tables. Search grids were drawn in red marker. Men and women who had never met Raymond Holt drove 2 hours to walk through fields and tree lines calling his name and Callie's. The official search, coordinated by the Clover Ridge Police Department and assisted by the County Sheriff's Office and the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, focused on the stretch of CR7 between Lou's roadside and the point where the county road eventually joined State Highway 28, which would have been Raymond's most direct route toward Lake Fontana. Helicopters swept the valleys. Trained search and rescue dogs were brought in from Knoxville. One of the dog teams, a handler named Ruth Stanhope and her bloodhound, a big, sad-faced dog named Walter, made a finding that would baffle investigators for years. Walter picked up a scent trail near the payphone outside Lou's roadside and followed it southwest along CR7 for approximately half a mile. Then the trail ended. Not faded, not weakened, ended. As if Raymond and Callie had simply ceased to exist at that point on the road. Ruth Stanhope had been doing search and rescue work for 14 years. She told investigators she had never seen a scent trail terminate so cleanly without any corresponding evidence. No vehicle, no disturbance, nothing. She said it was like tracking someone to the edge of a cliff that wasn't there. The volunteer search lasted 11 days. The official investigation stretched for months. Theories emerged and circulated and were examined and set aside. Theory 1. Raymond had staged his own disappearance. Maybe the divorce had broken something in him. Maybe the argument on the phone 3 weeks earlier was with someone he owed money to, and he had decided to start over somewhere else. But this theory had immediate problems. Raymond's bank account showed no unusual activity, no large withdrawals, no transfers. His credit card had not been used after the gas station charge on June 23rd. He had not taken his passport. He had not contacted any of his friends or family members. And, most crucially, most undeniably, he had taken Callie. Raymond Holt was many things, and whatever had driven him out of his marriage and into a quieter, lonelier version of his own life, everyone who knew him agreed on one thing with absolute certainty. He was a devoted, present, loving father. The idea that he would deliberately vanish and take Callie away from her mother, from her school, her friends, her grandmother's letters, her wildflower collection, was something no one who knew him could make themselves believe. Theory 2. A custody dispute that escalated. Perhaps Raymond had decided he didn't want to share Callie anymore. But this, too, fell apart quickly. Diane and Raymond's divorce, for all its quiet pain, had been legally clean. There were no contested custody hearings, no allegations of abuse or neglect on either side, no record of Raymond ever attempting to undermine Diane's relationship with Callie. Their arrangement was informal in the way that only amicable co-parenting arrangements can be, held together not by court mandates but by mutual respect and a shared love of the girl between them. Theory 3. An accident. Perhaps Raymond had driven off-road somewhere, lost control, gone over an embankment, ended up in one of the many small rivers and creek-fed ravines that cut through that part of Tennessee. It was possible, but the search teams had covered enormous ground, and the aerial teams had scanned hundreds of miles of roadside terrain. Nothing. The blue Ford Taurus, which would have been visible from the air against the green summer landscape, was simply not there. Every theory, followed to its end, hit the same wall. The car was gone. The car was the key to everything, and the car had disappeared as completely as the people inside it. Diane Holt did not sleep properly for the rest of that summer. She sat in her kitchen every morning and drank coffee she didn't taste and looked at the telephone and waited for it to ring with something other than sympathy. Friends came to sit with her. Her sister flew in from Georgia. A victim's advocate from the TBI visited twice a week for the first 2 months. Diane accepted all of this support with a kind of mechanical grace. She said thank you. She opened the door. She let people bring her casseroles and squeeze her hand. But inside, she was entirely somewhere else. She was on that road. She was following that blue car south through the summer heat, trying to see around the next curve. She never stopped trying to see around that curve. She would later say, "I never declared them dead. Not legally, not in my heart. Because declaring them dead means accepting that wherever they are, I can't reach them. And I cannot accept that. I refuse to accept that." What she did accept, slowly and reluctantly, was that the investigation had stalled. By the fall of 1990, Raymond and Callie Holt's case had been officially labeled a missing persons investigation with no active leads. It was still technically open, but it was open the way a wound is open, technically alive, bleeding slowly, with no clear path to healing. And then, 2 years after they vanished, a farmer named Herbert Caulfield was walking the fence line of his property near a community called Bells Creek, roughly 22 miles from Lou's roadside, and he found something in the weeds along the edge of his lower field. It was a backpack, small, yellow with purple trim, a child's backpack, and inside it was everything, and also nothing at all. Herbert Caulfield almost didn't call it in. He was 71 years old, a practical man who had spent 6 decades farming the same red clay earth, and when he found the backpack, his first thought was that some kid had tossed it out of a passing car. Teenagers did things like that. He almost just set it inside his barn and planned to drop it at the post office the next time he drove into town. But something made him open it. Maybe it was the way it was lying, face down in the tall grass, as if it had been placed rather than thrown. Maybe it was the odd stillness of it, sitting there in the morning heat without any sense that it had just been passing through. Whatever the reason, Herbert crouched down on his old knees and unzipped the main compartment, and what he saw inside made him stand back up slowly and walk straight to his farmhouse telephone. Inside the backpack were the following items: a spiral-bound notebook with a dark green cover, a folded paper road map of Tennessee, a small Ziploc bag containing 4 pressed wildflowers, a pencil, and a crumpled receipt from the Sunnyside gas station on Route 41S, time-stamped 10:22 a.m. on June 23, 1990. The notebook, investigators would discover, was Callie's field notebook, the one Raymond had packed for her 3 weeks earlier. Its pages were filled with her careful 12-year-old handwriting, notes about birds she had observed, sketches of trees, lists of animal tracks she'd learned to identify. The last entry was dated June 22, 1990, the night before the road trip. She had written about a hummingbird she'd seen at the feeder outside her father's kitchen window. She described its colors in careful detail. The last sentence she wrote was, "Tomorrow we go on our adventure." Nothing was written after that. The receipt from the gas station was consistent with the documented charge on Raymond's credit card, but there was something wrong about it that investigators didn't catch at first glance. When they looked more carefully, they realized the receipt was for a different amount than the charge on Raymond's credit card statement. The charge that had gone through on Raymond's card was for $31.40. The receipt in the backpack was for $27.15. The discrepancy was small, the kind of thing that might happen with a card processing error or with a manual entry mistake. But it was there, and no one could adequately explain it. The original gas station records from that date had been partially damaged in a building flood 2 months earlier, making a full comparison impossible. The road map was the most significant item by far. It was a standard Rand McNally, Tennessee road map, the kind sold at gas stations and truck stops across the state. It was folded imprecisely, the way maps always end up when someone has actually used them, and there were two handwritten markings on it. The first was a route line traced in blue ink along CR7 heading south, consistent with the route Raymond and Callie had been taking. The second was a circle, drawn in that same blue ink, around a point significantly west of the route, a community called Talbot's Mill, which sat at the edge of Dunmore County, roughly 40 miles from where the scent trail had ended near Lou's roadside. Talbot's Mill was not a town. It was barely a community, a cluster of a few dozen houses, a grain store, a small church, and, at its outskirts, a salvage yard and scrapyard that had operated under various owners since the 1960s. When investigators drove to Talbot's Mill and spoke with the owner of the salvage yard, a man named Burl Hennessy who had run the place since 1982, he told them he'd never heard of Raymond Holt, never seen a blue Ford Taurus he could specifically recall, and had nothing useful to offer. His records were kept in handwritten ledgers that were, he admitted, not exactly what you would call comprehensive. He processed dozens of vehicles a month. He couldn't be expected to remember everyone. The investigation noted the scrapyard, documented the interview with Burl Hennessy, and moved on. There were other leads to follow, other possibilities to exhaust. The scrapyard in Talbot's Mill was written up as a location of possible interest, and filed accordingly. For 8 more years, it stayed in the file. For 8 more years, Diane Holt lit a candle every June 23rd and sat at her kitchen table and talked to Raymond and Callie as if they were somewhere nearby, just out of reach, maybe just around that next curve in the road. She kept the backpack in Callie's old room, on the bed, between the pillow and the wall, where Callie used to keep it. She never washed it. 10 years after Raymond and Callie Holt drove south on Route 41S and into the silence, a man named Victor Oates was hired to modernize the record-keeping system at Hennessy's salvage and scrapyard in Talbot's Mill, Tennessee. It was the year 2000. Burl Hennessy was 64 years old and had been running his business on paper ledgers and hand memory for nearly 2 decades. His son, who had recently finished a business degree at East Tennessee State University, had convinced him that if the salvage yard was going to survive into the next century, they needed to digitize their records. Victor Oates was a quiet, methodical man in his late 30s who had done similar work for 3 other small businesses in Dunmore County. He arrived in March with a laptop and a flatbed scanner and began the slow, tedious process of entering 20 years of vehicle records into a database. It took him 3 weeks to get through the first 5 years of ledgers. It took him another 2 weeks to get through years 6 through 10. And it was in the middle of the 11th year, the year 1990, that Victor Oates sat back in his folding chair inside Burl Hennessy's cluttered office and looked at his screen for a long moment before reaching for the telephone. In the ledger dated August through September 1990, there was an entry for a 1987 Ford Taurus, blue, 4-door. The VIN number, a unique 17-character identifier assigned to every vehicle manufactured in the United States, had been partially recorded in Burl's cramped handwriting. Victor had done his best to enter it accurately. Out of habit, he ran the VIN through the Tennessee DMV database he had access to from a previous county contract. The search came back with a match. The vehicle was registered to Raymond Allen Holt of 14, Delaney Street, Clover Ridge, Tennessee, and it had been listed as a missing persons case evidence flag since July 1990. Victor sat there for a moment. Then he called the Dunmore County Sheriff's Office. The Sheriff's Office called the TBEI. The TBEI called the original case file number and began pulling threads. What emerged over the following weeks was a picture that defied simple explanation. Hennessy's records, fragmentary as they were, indicated that the blue Ford Taurus had been received at the scrapyard on September 4, 1990. That was approximately 10 weeks after Raymond and Callie had vanished. The vehicle had been logged as abandoned property, no registered owner claim, meaning that whoever delivered it to the scrapyard had done so without any formal paperwork indicating it was stolen or surrendered. Under Tennessee law at the time, A vehicle could be processed as abandoned property after a holding period, provided certain notification steps had been followed. Beryl Hennessy maintained, when investigators returned with a far more serious set of questions, that all the proper steps had been taken. He had posted a notification. He had followed the process. But when investigators asked him who had brought the car in, who had delivered it to his yard, Beryl Hennessy said something that stopped everyone in the room cold. He said he didn't know. He said the car had been left outside his gate overnight. He'd found it there in the morning with a handwritten note on the windshield that said, "Take it. Runs rough. Titles in the glove box." He'd found a title inside the glove box. He'd processed it as abandoned property. The title he'd found was a valid Tennessee vehicle title. It was signed, but the signature on the title was not Raymond Holt's. Investigators compared it to documents in Raymond's name and confirmed someone had forged Raymond Holt's signature to transfer ownership of his car to an unnamed private party, from whom it had then allegedly been abandoned at the scrapyard. Someone had obtained Raymond's car at some point after he disappeared. Someone had forged his signature on the title, and someone had dropped the car at a scrapyard 40 miles off his route, where it had been sitting, slowly rusting, for almost a decade. But that was not the most disturbing discovery. The most disturbing discovery came when forensic investigators, working with what remained of the vehicle after 10 years in a salvage yard, examined the trunk. The trunk lining had been replaced. Not repaired, replaced. Someone had gone to the trouble of removing the original trunk liner from a 10-year-old Ford Taurus and putting in a new one. In a car that was otherwise unremarkable in its wear and aging, the trunk liner was conspicuously, almost offensively, new. Beneath the new liner, still adhered to the metal of the trunk floor in ways that the replacement couldn't entirely cover. Investigators found trace evidence that made everyone working the case understand, in a way they hadn't fully before, that something very serious had happened in that car, something that someone had worked hard to hide. There's a particular quality to forensic investigation that most people don't understand until they encounter it, a kind of terrible patience. The evidence doesn't announce itself. It waits. It exists in the molecular space between what happened and what someone wanted you to believe happened. And the only way to find it is to look very slowly, very carefully, at everything. The lead forensic investigator assigned to the re-examination of the whole case in the year 2000 was a TBI specialist named Dr. Angela Marsh. She had been with the TBI for 11 years. She had worked cases involving fire, flood, decomposition, and deliberate concealment. She later said that the Holt vehicle was one of the most carefully cleaned crime scenes she had ever encountered, and she used that phrase precisely, crime scene. The replacement trunk liner, she confirmed, had been installed post-production, meaning it was not a factory replacement or standard repair. It had been cut to fit from a different Ford model's liner, then adhered with the commercial adhesive available at most auto supply stores. Under ultraviolet light, the metal beneath the liner showed a patterning that Dr. Marsh described in her report as consistent with an attempt to remediate biological material. The remediation had been largely effective. Largely. In the seams of the trunk, in the folded edges of metal where the floor met the walls, trace analysts found two categories of evidence. The first was fibers, synthetic fabric fibers that did not match any clothing item documented in the Holt household inventory, and that were inconsistent with the car's original interior. They were dark-colored fibers, dense, the kind used in heavy-duty workwear or industrial gear. They had not come from Raymond or Callie. The second category was biological. In the deepest seam along the rear trunk wall, analysts recovered a sample sufficient for DNA analysis. The sample did not match Raymond Holt, whose DNA profile had been established from items collected at his home in 1990. It did not match Callie Holt. It was male DNA, and it was clean enough for database comparison. When the sample was run through the Tennessee State Criminal Database, there was a match. The match was to a man named Dale Pruitt. Dale Pruitt was 43 years old and was currently serving a 19-year sentence at Riverbend Maximum Security Institution in Nashville for a series of violent offenses that included aggravated assault and kidnapping committed in 1993. His DNA had been entered into the state database during his incarceration. Dale Pruitt had a history that, when investigators began pulling it, contained a detail that made the hair stand up on the back of more than one detective's neck. In the early 1990s, before his 1993 conviction, Pruitt had lived and worked in Dunmore County, Tennessee. More specifically, he had worked as a mechanic at an independent auto shop on the outskirts of a small community called Bells Creek. Bells Creek, the same community where, 2 years after the disappearance, a farmer named Herbert Caulfield had found Callie Holt's yellow and purple backpack lying in the weeds along his fence line. When investigators went back to interview people in Bells Creek about Dale Pruitt, they found something that the original 1990 investigation had missed entirely. There was a man, a retired trucker named Odell Barnes, who told investigators that in the summer of 1990, he had seen a blue Ford Taurus parked behind the auto shop where Pruitt worked. He remembered it because it was there for several days and it seemed odd. There was no work order on it. No one was working on it. It was just sitting there. And then one day it wasn't there anymore. Odell had never been interviewed by investigators in 1990. His name had never come up. He had simply lived with this memory for 10 years, not knowing it mattered, not knowing there was a blue Ford Taurus that had driven off the edge of the world and taken 2 people with it. When investigators attempted to interview Dale Pruitt directly about the Holt case, they were met with a response that would become one of the most agonizing dead ends in the entire investigation. Dale Pruitt had died in Riverbend Maximum Security Institution 7 months earlier, March 14, 2000, from a cardiac event. He had been 53 years old. He had died without ever being questioned about Raymond or Callie Holt. He had died without ever knowing, so far as anyone could tell, that investigators had connected his DNA to a car that belonged to 2 people who had never been found. He took whatever he knew with him. But Dale Pruitt was not the only thread the renewed investigation pulled from the spool of 1990. When investigators revisited the original case files with the new forensic findings in hand, they found something buried in a supplemental report dated November 1990, a report that had been filed, logged, and apparently never adequately followed up on during the original investigation. The report documented an interview with a local mechanic named Gary Luntz, who at the time operated a small repair shop on the eastern edge of Bells Creek. In the original 1990 interview, Gary Luntz had told investigators that he had seen a blue Ford Taurus parked along the county road near his shop approximately 4 days after the disappearance. He said he hadn't thought much of it. He said the car was just parked. He said he didn't see anyone inside. The original report noted this information, categorized it as unconfirmed sighting, low priority given distance from search area, and moved on. When investigators found Gary Luntz in the year 2000, he was 61 years old and had retired from the mechanic business 3 years earlier. He lived in a small house in Bells Creek with his wife and a large vegetable garden. He received the investigators politely, made them coffee, and then, when they told him why they were there, he was quiet for a long time. What came out of that silence was different from what he had said in 1990. Gary Luntz told investigators that the blue Ford Taurus had not been empty. He said there had been someone in the driver's seat, a man. He said he had not mentioned this in the original interview because, at the time, he had been afraid. He had recognized the man behind the wheel, he said. He had recognized him as someone connected to Dale Pruitt, not Pruitt himself, but someone who moved in Pruitt's orbit, someone who Gary Luntz knew, from local knowledge and careful observation, had a reputation for violence. He did not know this person's legal name. He knew him by a nickname that other people in the community had used. Investigators worked with that description for months. They were unable to establish a clear second-party identity from Gary Luntz's account. Gary was consistent in his description: medium height, heavy build, wearing work clothes, driving Raymond's car south along the county road at a time when Raymond himself was already missing. but he could not give investigators enough identifying information to make an arrest or even a formal suspect designation. When investigators asked Gary Lantz why he had changed his story between 1990 and 2000, he looked at them steadily and said, "Because back then, I was scared. And now I'm old enough to decide that being scared isn't a good enough reason to stay quiet." There was one additional development in this phase of the investigation that deserves mention, not because it answered anything, but because it illustrated with painful clarity how close the original search had come to finding something important. In reviewing the volunteer search records from July 1990, investigators discovered that one of the search grid had included the general area around Bells Creek, but had not extended to the outskirts where the auto shop operated, or to the fields beyond it, or to the fence line of Herbert Caulfield's property. The search grid had stopped approximately 2 miles short. 2 miles. That was the margin. That was the distance between the search line and the spot where Callie's backpack had lain in the weeds for 2 years before Herbert Caulfield found it. 2 miles. And the entire shape of the investigation might have been different. Might have been. But wasn't. Diane Holt, when investigators came to her home in Clover Ridge in the fall of 2000 to update her on the renewed findings, listened to everything they told her without interrupting. She sat at her kitchen table, the same kitchen table where she had spent 10 years waiting for the telephone to ring, and she held a cup of coffee she didn't drink and she listened to every word. When the investigator finished speaking, she asked only one question. She asked, "Do you know where they are?" The investigator, a TBI agent named Marcus Webb who had been working missing persons cases for 17 years, looked at this woman who had been carrying this for a decade, and he told her the truth. He said, "No, Mrs. Holt. We don't know where they are." She nodded. She thanked him for coming. She showed him to the door. After he left, she went back to her kitchen table and sat there until the coffee was cold. Let's step back from the timeline for a moment and look at the shape of what had been assembled, because by the end of the year 2000, investigators had built a picture. It was not a complete picture. It had large, terrible gaps in it, spaces where the facts simply gave way to theory and theory gave way to silence. But it had a shape, and the shape was dark. Someone had intercepted Raymond and Callie Holt on or near CR7 on June 23, 1990. The car had not malfunctioned and rolled into a ravine. It had not been driven into a lake. It had ended up, by late summer of 1990, at a location connected to Dale Pruitt, a man with a history of violent crime who lived and worked in the exact area where the family's traces had accumulated. How had this interception happened? The working theory, never confirmed, never prosecuted, existing in the realm of the most likely rather than the proven, was a staged breakdown. Someone had created a reason for Raymond to stop the car on a rural stretch of road. A vehicle blocking the road, perhaps, or someone flagging him down. Raymond Holt was, by all accounts, the kind of man who stopped for people who needed help. He would not have driven past someone in distress. He would have pulled over. From there, the theory grew darker in ways that investigators documented carefully but could never prove. The DNA evidence in the trunk suggested that Dale Pruitt, or someone connected to him, had been inside that car after the Holts disappeared, had been in the trunk, or had placed something in the trunk. The replacement trunk liner suggested a deliberate, methodical effort to conceal what had happened. This was not the impulsive act of someone who had committed a crime of opportunity and panicked. Someone had thought about this. Someone had taken time and effort to clean the car, to source a replacement liner, to forge a vehicle title and deliver the car to a scrapyard far enough from the main search area that it might never surface. This level of effort, the planning it suggested, pointed toward premeditation. And premeditation pointed toward the question that had no clean answer. Had Raymond Holt been targeted specifically? Had someone known he would be on that road that day? The argument on the phone 3 weeks before the trip. "You don't get to tell me what to do anymore. Just stay away from us." Raymond's question to Diane about whether she would fight for Callie if something happened to him. The phone message where he said goodbye in a way that felt final. Had Raymond known something was coming? Had he been afraid of something in those weeks before the trip? And if so, of what? Of whom? Investigators could not answer these questions. The person in Raymond's life who might have been threatening him, the person on the other end of that phone call, was never identified. Gary Lunt's description of the second man in Bells Creek was never matched to a specific individual. Dale Pruitt was dead. The title forgery was traced as far as the salvage yard and no further. There was a wall, and behind that wall were the people who knew what happened on CR7 on that summer Saturday. And they were either dead, or silent, or both. What investigators were left with was this: Raymond and Callie Holt had encountered something on that road. Evidence suggested criminal involvement by at least one individual, Dale Pruitt, and possibly a second, unidentified individual. The car had been deliberately moved and processed. The effort to conceal the vehicle was inconsistent with an accident and consistent with a violent crime that someone wanted buried. And in 10 years of searching, no bodies had ever been found. No bodies. This fact sits in the middle of the Holt case like a stone. It is the hardest thing to write around, the hardest thing to accept, and the hardest thing to let go of. Without recovered remains, there was no murder case. Without a murder case, there was no prosecution. Without a prosecution, there was no justice. There was only the evidence of something terrible, pointing toward people who were no longer reachable, arranged around a silence that could not be broken. Diane Holt continued to attend the annual vigil that the community of Clover Ridge held every June 23rd. She lit 2 candles, one for Raymond, one for Callie. She placed flowers. She stood quietly for the duration. She never spoke at the vigil. She said that when she tried to put words to what she felt, the words were never right, and she would rather say nothing than say the wrong thing. Maya, Callie's childhood best friend, attended the vigil every year too. She grew up, went to college, became a teacher. She kept a photograph of Callie on her desk. Callie at 11, a year before she vanished, holding up a field guide and squinting at the camera in a way that meant she was trying not to laugh. Maya would tell her students, sometimes, about her friend. She would tell them about the field notebook, about the wildflowers, about the hummingbird entry. She said she wanted someone besides herself to know that Callie Holt had existed, had been real, had written careful notes about hummingbirds and planned adventures, and thought the world was full of things worth paying attention to. Earl Piquette, the neighbor who had waved goodbye to the blue Taurus on the morning of June 23, 1990, still lived on Delaney Street. He was an old man by the year 2000. He still grew tomatoes every summer. And every summer, without fail, on the 23rd of June, he stood at his fence in the morning and looked at the empty driveway next door and thought about a man who honked twice, short and cheerful, and a little girl with her feet up on the dashboard, heading south into the summer morning. The wave. The 2 honks. The blue car reversing out of the driveway and heading down the street. That was where it ended for everyone who had known them. That was where it had to end, because nothing else was ever found. The Holt case was formally redesignated as an active cold case by the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation in November 2000, following the forensic findings related to the salvage yard vehicle. This designation meant that the file would be reviewed annually, that any new evidence would be processed, and that the case would remain open for as long as the TBI continued to operate. In practice, an active cold case designation is both a promise and a limitation. It is a promise that no one has officially decided to stop looking. It is a limitation in that looking becomes increasingly passive with every passing year, increasingly dependent on new technology or new witnesses or the kind of luck that cold cases sometimes need to crack open. A deathbed confession, an old diary, a conversation someone finally decides to have. None of those things came. The TBI reviewed the Holt file in 2001, 2002, 2003, and beyond. Each review noted the same essential facts. No new evidence. No new witnesses. No recovered remains. Dale Pruitt remained the only individual whose DNA had been connected to the vehicle, and Dale Pruitt was dead. The unidentified second individual seen by Gary Luntz was never named. The person on the other end of Raymond's phone argument 3 weeks before the trip was never identified. The gap between the original search grid and the location of Callie's backpack, 2 miles, 2 terrible miles, remained in the record as a silent indictment of what the initial investigation had missed. Diane Holt lived in the house in Holland Falls for the rest of her life. In her final years, she developed a habit of writing in a journal, not unlike Callie's field notebook, though Diane never made that connection consciously. She wrote about her day. She wrote about the weather. She wrote about what she had cooked for dinner. And at the end of every entry, she wrote a line or two addressed to Raymond and Callie. Not prayers, exactly. More like updates. More like the kind of thing you'd say to someone you hadn't seen in a while, keeping them caught up on the small details of your life. Because you believed, you had to believe, that someday they'd be able to hear it. Before she died, Diane gave an interview to a journalist writing about cold cases in rural Tennessee. It was the only formal interview she had ever given about her ex-husband and daughter. She was composed throughout. She answered every question carefully and honestly. And at the end of the interview, unprompted, she said something that the journalist included verbatim in her article, because it needed no improvement. I just wanted to know where my baby went. That's all I ever wanted. Not justice, not answers, not explanations. I mean, those things too. But underneath all of that, just the simplest thing. I just wanted to know where she went. The journalist wrote that Diane sat quietly for a moment after saying this, and then folded her hands in her lap, and then looked out the window at the morning, and said nothing more for a long time. Diane Holt passed away in 2011. She was 63 years old. The cause was cancer, a disease that had been in her for 3 years before she was diagnosed, working quietly and systematically in the way that some terrible things do. Her obituary noted that she was survived by her sister in Georgia, by her mother in Alabama, and by the memory of her daughter, Callie, still listed officially as a missing person. The obituary did not describe how Diane had lit 2 candles every June 23rd. It did not describe the journals. It did not describe the sound of the telephone on the night of June 23rd, 1990, when it finally stopped ringing with updates and fell silent for good. Those things live in the people who knew her, and they will live there until those people are gone too. The whole case remains open. No bodies have ever been recovered. No one has ever been charged in connection with the disappearance of Raymond and Callie Holt. Dale Pruitt's DNA remains the only physical evidence connecting a specific individual to the vehicle, and that connection, while deeply suggestive, was never sufficient, without corroborating physical evidence or witness testimony, to support a prosecution. The blue Ford Taurus was further processed at Hennessy's salvage yard following the forensic examination in 2000. There was little enough left of it by that point. 10 years in a scrapyard does things to a car that even careful investigation cannot fully reverse. What the car remembered, it had already told. What it could not tell, what nothing in this case has ever been able to tell, is where Raymond and Callie Holt are. Whether they are in the red clay earth of Dunmore County. Whether they are somewhere along the banks of one of the creeks that cut through those hills. Whether they are somewhere that will eventually surface, as these things sometimes do, in the slow and patient way that the earth sometimes releases what it holds. No one knows. Raymond was 38 when he disappeared. If he were alive today, he would be in his 70s, old enough to have gray hair and grandchildren in a garden of his own. Maybe. Old enough to watch Callie become the wildlife biologist she intended to be. Callie was 12. If she were alive today, she would be in her mid-40s. She might have children of her own. She might have published research papers about the animals she loved to catalog. She might still keep a field notebook. She might still press wildflowers between the pages and write careful sentences about what she saw. She told her father that summer, on the phone with Maya the night before the trip, "We're going somewhere special." She was right. She just didn't know what kind of special it would be. And that is the thing about this case, about all cases like this, that stays with you long after you've set it down. It is not the violence, as terrible as violence is. It is not even the injustice of the dead carrying their secrets. It is the smallness of the lives that were interrupted. The dinosaur pancakes on Sundays. The wildflower collection. The two honks from a blue car reversing out of a driveway on a summer morning. Those are the things that were taken. Those are the things that cannot be returned. What would you do if someone you loved disappeared on an ordinary day? If the last evidence of them was a gas station receipt and a phone message and a wave from a neighbor? What would you do if you searched for 10 years and found a car, but not an answer? The Holts asked us to hold their story. This is us holding it. If this case disturbed you, if it made you sit with the weight of it the way these stories are meant to make us sit, then hold it a little longer. Remember Raymond. Remember Callie. Remember the June morning when the blue Ford Taurus backed out of the driveway on Delaney Street and the whole world was still ordinary. Remember, too, that there are hundreds of cases like this one. Families still waiting at kitchen tables. Candles still lit every year on the anniversary of the last morning. The world before digital tracking, before cell towers that record location, before the technology that makes it harder, not impossible, but harder, for people to simply vanish. Think about who might know something. Think about what it cost to stay silent for 30 years, and what it might be worth to someone still waiting if you decided not to. And if you know anything at all, about what happened on CR7 in Dunmore County, Tennessee, on June 23, 1990, there is a case number and a tip line in a family whose memory deserves more than silence. There is always a tip line, and it is never too late. Please subscribe for more.